The fire lit itself. Mavis had not been in the hall long enough to understand what she was seeing when the great hearth on the north wall, unlit, cold, swept clean in the way of things that were not expected to be used, erupted in amber light. She felt the heat on her face before she registered what it meant. She was still holding the sealed letter she had ridden 3 days to deliver. It was damp from where her gloved hand had gripped it through the rain. The wax seal softened and slightly smeared from the pressure of her thumb over long hours on the road. The hall had gone perfectly silent. There were perhaps 200 people in it, courtiers in formal dress, lords with their household banners standing behind them at ceremonial intervals, servants pressed to the walls like a held breath, candles massed everywhere in iron candelabras, the long tables cleared and draped in white for the occasion. At the far end of the hall, on the raised dais, where a canopy of cloth of gold hung between 2 carved stone columns, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories stood at the center of what had been, until approximately 30 seconds ago, his betrothal ceremony. He was very tall. Mavis registered that first, because she had been told she would have to push through a crowd to reach whoever she was supposed to give the letter to. And the man at the dais removed all doubt about who held authority in this room. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, and dressed in the formal black of ceremony, a heavy gold chain of office across his chest that caught the candlelight, and he had the particular quality of stillness that Mavis had observed in her experience as a courier, the stillness of someone who was accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence, who had stopped noticing that they did, because it had been happening for so long. He was looking at her, not at the hearth, which was still coming fully alight behind her, the ancient iron grate beginning to glow red at its base, the flames climbing higher than seemed proportional to the wood that was not there. Not at the woman beside him on the dais, whose expression had not changed, but whose hand had tightened on the formal bouquet she was holding until her knuckles showed white against the dark stems. At her, Mavis, who was standing in the doorway of the great hall in a road-muddied travelling cloak, rain-damp hair half escaped from its braid and falling in pieces across her jaw, holding a sealed letter that had nothing to do with any of this. She had a compass at her belt. She had carried it her entire life, her mother's before that, and before that she had no clear knowledge. It was a small iron thing, no larger than her palm, with a needle that had never once stopped spinning. She had never met a direction it agreed to settle on for more than a moment. She had tried, methodically, at different latitudes and longitudes and elevations, in buildings and in open fields. She had tried it pointed at lodestones, pointed at water, pointed out of windows toward the North Star. It was, as far as she had been able to determine in 22 years of carrying it, broken, not useless. She had kept it anyway, because her mother had asked her to, and because the weight of it at her hip had become a habit too deep to question. The needle had stopped. It was pointing at the man on the dais. Mavis looked down at it. She looked back up at the hall full of people who were all looking at her. She looked at the hearth, which had been cold and sealed and ceremonially laid for decoration for what appeared to be a very long time. The stones around its mantel darker, where old smoke had stained the mortar in some era that predated everyone in this room, and which was now burning with the focused certainty of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment and had simply required the right person to walk through the right door. She thought, I only came to deliver a letter. The woman beside the Alpha King on the dais was called Lady Mathilde of House Varent, and Mavis understood this in the first 20 minutes, because people kept saying her name in tight, careful voices. Not to her, never directly to her, but around her, the way people spoke of weather approaching, or of a decision already made and not yet announced. Lady Matilda was everything Mavis was not in that room, formally gowned in the deep wine red of her house, her dark hair pinned in an elaborate structure that spoke of hours of preparation and the resources to support it, her bearing so composed that it almost looked relaxed, almost. Her eyes had gone to the hearth once when it first lit, a single clear look that took in the entirety of what was happening. And then she had done something Mavis found more frightening than any display of rage or grief. She had looked away from it. She had decided to look away from it, and she had done it with complete control, and she had redirected her attention to the Alpha King beside her, with the calm of a woman who was already thinking 3 steps forward. That told Mavis more about Matilda of House Varant than anything that followed. This was someone who did not waste her composure on the immediate problem. She was already at the next one. The ceremony did not resume. Mavis was not sure what usually happened when a hearth that had been cold for 3 centuries ignited in the middle of a betrothal. But apparently the protocol for it was not something the court had thought necessary to preserve. People stood and whispered to each other at careful volumes, and no one seemed to know who was supposed to give an order, because the man who usually gave orders was standing still in the middle of his dais, looking at a courier in the doorway, and without him the room did not know how to proceed. The Alpha King gave the order. He stepped down from the dais. The court parted for him the way water moves when something inevitable passes through it. Not hurrying, not scrambling, simply adjusting to a fact of the physical world. He crossed the hall without looking at anyone else, and stopped in front of Mavis at a distance that was closer than a stranger stood, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and was aware of the size of him in the particular visceral way of someone standing near something that could, if it chose, make them very small. He was looking at the compass. "What is that?" he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who had not needed to raise it in years, because things tended to quiet when he spoke. He was not looking at her, not yet. He was looking at the compass the way you looked at something you had seen before, but could not place in the correct time or context. Something half recognized, half expected. "It was my mother's," Mavis said, because it was, and because she did not know what else to say, and because the truth was the simplest available answer. He looked up at her then. His eyes were very dark, dark enough that the hearth's amber reflection moved in them like a living thing, something warm and unfixed, and his face was precise and hard-featured, a jaw that suggested he had made difficult decisions and held them through difficulty, and a scar that ran from the edge of his left jaw to the corner of his mouth, silver pale against the darker tone of his skin, the kind of mark that had been earned a long time ago and was no longer something he thought about. He was 30, or near it. He had the look of someone who had been exactly this age for a while, not old, but settled into the full weight of himself. "What is your name?" he said. "Mavis," she said. "I was sent to deliver a letter. I don't know what this is." She meant the hearth. She meant the compass. She meant the entire situation pressing in from every direction. He seemed to understand exactly which of these she meant, because he did not ask for clarification. "Show me the compass," he said. She held it out, flat on her palm. His hand closed over hers to steady it, not to take the compass, not to examine it apart from her, simply to hold her hand still in the air between them with one large warm grip. For 1 second. He looked at the needle. She felt the warmth of his hand after he had already released her, a residual heat in her fingers that took longer than it should have to subside. The needle was still pointing at him. "Your letter," he said. And she remembered she was still holding it, and she gave it to him, and he handed it to a man at his shoulder without looking at it, as if the letter had already ceased to be the point. "Ronan," said a voice from somewhere in the crowd. Not a question. A single word of acknowledgement, or possibly a warning, or possibly an attempt by someone to recall him to where he was supposed to be standing. He did not respond to it. "You're staying," he said, and walked back toward the dais. Mavis stood in the doorway with her empty hand and her compass and the warmth of his grip still in her fingers, and watched him go. The old archivist arrived that evening. His name was Aldous, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom hurrying had become physiologically inadvisable, and he came to the hall the way a man came when he had been expecting a summons for longer than seemed reasonable, and was, under the patience, somewhat gratified to have been correct. He carried a book, not a display book, not a ceremonial record of lineages, a working document, worn dark at the corners, with tabs of coloured leather marking specific pages, the kind of thing that got handled daily over many years. He did not look at the Alpha King first. He looked at Mavis, who was standing to one side, because no one had told her where to stand, and she had defaulted to the position least likely to be in anyone's way, the position she had occupied in most rooms for most of her life. He looked at her. Then he looked at the compass on her belt. Then, in the particular order of a man verifying what he already suspected, he opened his book. 314 years, he said to the hall, without preamble. The hall had rebuilt itself from the silence it had held all afternoon. The court was assembled again, minus ceremony, minus the white-draped tables, standing in the particular configuration of people who wanted very much to understand what they were watching. The last time this hearth lit in the presence of a living person, Aldous said, the Alpha Queen of the Northern Territories had just been recognized here, in this hall, in the presence of the full court, in the same manner. He held the book open so the assembled court could see, though most of them were too far to read the dense old script. 314 years. There is a record. I have verified the record. I have read it against 3 independent sources this afternoon alone. He paused, and he was the kind of man who used pauses the way other men used emphasis. She is carrying the lunar finder. The hall went very quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. This was not the silence of surprise. This was the silence of people recalibrating, of a room full of individuals rapidly recalculating what the last 2 hours had meant and what the next 2 hours were likely to bring. "What is a lunar finder?" Mavis said. Aldous looked at her with the patient quality of someone explaining something to a person who had every reason not to know it and no particular fault in not knowing it. "It was made for the last Alpha Queen," he said. "Cast iron, no larger than a palm. Needle that spins without fixing on any direction." He paused. "Unless the Alpha King to whom she is bonded is within range, then it stops." Mavis looked down at the compass on her belt. The needle was fixed and perfectly still. "It is not a coincidence," Aldous said to the room at large, in the tone of a man who had decided some things needed to be said plainly, for the record, before anyone attempted to turn them into something else. "The hearth, the compass, together, these are not a coincidence. The institutional record is clear on this. I will not say otherwise, because it would be convenient for anyone in particular." Lady Matilda of House Varant had been standing to the right of the dais throughout this recital, her expression utterly composed, her hands folded at her waist. When Aldous finished, she said, in a voice of precise, measured civility, "The institution has records of many things, Brother Aldous. Not all of them bear directly on the present situation." "That is correct," Aldous said cheerfully. "This one does, however." The Alpha King had not spoken during any of this. He was standing at the centre of the hall, arms folded, looking at Mavis with the same quality of attention he had given the compass, not cataloguing her, not making any visible decision, simply looking, as if she were something he had been trying to locate for a long time, and was now attempting to reconcile with where he had actually found her, and whether the finding and the place was something he could hold in the same thought at the same time. Mavis looked back at him. She thought about saying something. She thought about the 3-day ride, the rain, the letter she had been paid to deliver and had now delivered, and the fact that she had nowhere specifically to be afterward because she had no house left to return to, no household, no posting, no next assignment already arranged. She had been between things, and she had taken the job because between things was an uncomfortable place to remain. She did not say any of it. She said, "I didn't know what the compass was." He said, "I know." Across the hall, Lady Matilda turned away from both of them and began a quiet, contained conversation with one of her senior attendants, the kind of conversation that would, Mavis thought, cover a very great deal of ground in a very short amount of time. They gave Mavis a room in the eastern wing, not the upper floors where the court resided in apartments with high windows and carved furniture, but also not the lower quarters where the working staff ate and slept and lived in the practical world behind the ceremony. She was placed somewhere between, in a corridor that had the particular quality of belonging to neither world, with clean stone walls and a narrow window that looked over the inner courtyard. She sat on the edge of a bed that was better than anything she had slept on in several months, and held the compass open on her palm, and watched the needle rest in its fixed position for the first time in her living memory, and she stayed that way for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had never once explained what the compass was, or why they were to keep it hidden, and to carry it always, and never speak of it to people who asked. She thought the explanation had been inside the thing all along, waiting for the right room and the right person in it. She thought about what it meant that the right person had been a king with a prior claim already made, and she felt the strange, specific guilt of something arriving too late and at the wrong moment, and the equally strange, specific recognition that the timing was not hers to have managed. A servant came in the early evening, a quiet young woman named Pell, who brought a tray without being asked, and set it on the small table without comment, and did not treat Mavis with the particular brand of contempt that would have told her exactly what the household thought of her presence. This was more than Mavis had expected, and she was grateful for it in the specific, wordless way of someone who had not been expecting a kindness and received one. "Is there anything you need?" Pell asked. "I don't know what I need," Mavis said honestly. Pell nodded as if this was a sensible answer, and went away. What Mavis needed, she decided, when she had finished the food and the hall outside the narrow window had gone dark and lit only by torches, was to understand the shape of the danger she was in. Not from the Alpha King. She did not feel danger from him, though she could not have fully explained why, given that he was by any measure the most powerful person she had ever been in a room with. From Lady Matilda, who had looked away from an impossible fire with complete control, and immediately begun a quiet conversation, and who had a household of attendants and years of carefully built position, and the legitimate claim of 6 years of negotiation and a territorial alliance that the court genuinely needed. Matilda came to her room that night. She came alone, which was the first surprising thing. She came without a guard, without a witness of any kind, and she knocked before entering, which was so fundamentally civil that Mavis was immediately more frightened than she would have been if Matilda had come through the door in any other way. She was still in her formal gown, though the elaborate pinned structure of her hair had been partially released. One dark curl fallen to her jaw, the rest still held, but no longer immaculate, and she was very beautiful in the candlelight, and her eyes, which were pale grey, held nothing in them at all that Mavis could read. "I would like to see the compass," she said. Mavis held it out on her palm. Matilda reached for it. Her fingers closed around the iron casing. She lifted, or attempted to lift. The compass did not move. It sat in Mavis's palm, as if it had been nailed there, as if the metal had fused with her skin, as if it had no interest in belonging to anyone else. Matilda released it. The silence between them was long. "I see," Matilda said in her precise civil voice, and straightened. "I have spent 6 years building toward an alliance this court and this territory genuinely need. I would like you to understand that I am not wrong about the alliance, only about whether the alliance will happen." "I understand it," Mavis said. "Good," Matilda said. She paused at the door with her hand on the frame. "I will be filing a petition with the council in the morning, regarding the evidentiary weight of a 300-year-old record, and whether a single anomalous event constitutes sufficient grounds for institutional recognition. She looked at Mavis with those pale grey eyes in the candlelight. I want you to know that I am doing it through the correct channels. I am doing it because I believe I am right about what the Alliance means for this territory, and I am asking the Council to agree with me. I am not asking them to decide I am more important than the rules. She paused once more. I am asking them to decide the rules. She left without waiting for a response, the door closing precisely behind her. Mavis sat with the compass for a long time after. She did not sleep well. She woke once in the deep middle of the night, and went to stand at the narrow window, and she could see at an angle, through the courtyard, and across the roof of the lower hall, one corner of the great hall's high window, the amber glow still moving within it, warm and steady. The fire was still burning. It was going to keep burning. She had a certainty about this, that she could not have explained rationally, but she had learned in 22 years of carrying a compass that told her nothing, that sometimes a certainty arrived without rational apparatus and simply needed to be acknowledged. She thought about what it meant to be 300 years of dormancy, ending in the wrong room at the wrong time. She thought about Lady Matilda, who had done everything correctly and was going to do everything correctly now, and who deserved something Mavis could not give her. And she thought about the Alpha King, who had said I know in the flat, uncomplicated way of someone stating a fact, and who had not yet told her whether knowing it made any difference to the decision he was being asked to make. She was still thinking about all of it when morning came, and the light through the narrow window changed from black to grey to the thin, pale gold of an overcast dawn. There were 2 guards at her door when she opened it. Not threatening. They stood at ease, positioned where they could see in both directions down the corridor, and one of them nodded to her and said good morning in an ordinary voice, and did not move from his post. Mavis stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at them, and understood very clearly that they had been placed there at someone's specific order, and that the order had not been Matilda's, because Matilda was going through the correct channels, and placing a personal guard on her quarry's door was not a correct channel, and Matilda was far too careful to make that kind of visible contradiction. She asked, later. She was being escorted to the hall for breakfast when she passed the Alpha King coming from the council wing, and she asked simply, "Did you put those guards at my door?" He looked at her directly. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, in the considering way he had, not evasive, not hesitating, calculating how to say something accurate with the least possible flourish. "Because there are people in this court who are better served by your absence than your presence, and because I don't know yet what to do about everything else. But I know that." He said it the way he said everything, as if the truth were the cleanest available instrument. Then he continued down the corridor, without waiting for her response. She stood in the hallway and thought about the cost of that. He had not announced it. He had not explained it to Matilda or the council or anyone who might object, had not framed it as policy or procedure or protection of an institutional asset. He had simply done it and left the explanation for when she happened to ask. She found herself thinking that this was very like him, though she had known him less than 2 days, and she was aware that this was probably too quick a conclusion and did not especially care. That evening there was a gathering in the lower hall, not a formal occasion, simply the court's habitual way of filling the space between dinner and sleeping, wine and candlelight, and the low hum of people in proximity. Mavis moved through it at the edges, which was where she had always moved through rooms, and the crowd was thicker than she had expected. When it surged, a sudden press as people shifted from one side of the room to the other for a reason she didn't catch. She had no time to find the edge before the weight of it was on her. Ronan's arm came around her, before she had registered that he was close, solid, certain, pulling her into him until the crowd passed and the corridor cleared. He did not look down at her. She did not look up at him. His arm fell away when the space opened again, and he said nothing at all. And she told herself that her pulse was from the crowd, and mostly believed it for the duration of the walk back to her corridor. She had found a reason to cross through the great hall earlier, on her way from the library, where Aldous had given her temporary access to the Eastern records. The hall had been empty, truly empty, no servants, no torchbearers making rounds, and the Alpha King was there. He was sitting in one of the low chairs before the ancient hearth, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, looking into the fire with the specific quality of attention a person gives to something they are trying to understand. He did not see her in the doorway, or he saw her and chose not to shift his weight in her direction, which in that moment amounted to the same courtesy. She looked at him long enough to see that he was tired, not the depleted tiredness of someone who had gone past their limit, quieter, older than that. The tiredness of a man who carried a large weight competently and constantly, and had not, in some considerable time, set it down. His face in the firelight was less precise than it was in the hall. The scar along his jaw was very visible in the warm light, silver pale, and his hands were still, and he looked. She found herself thinking it, and then not taking it back, like someone sitting with a question he had not yet been able to answer, and was not sure had a good answer available. She went back to her room without passing through. It was not her moment to be in that room with him, and she knew enough about moments to recognize when they belonged to someone else. The council hearing was formal, and cold in the way that rooms designed to strip out feeling were always formal and cold. Mavis stood at the center of the council chamber, a room built entirely of grey stone, with a ceiling too high to be comfortable and a floor too hard to be anything but deliberate, and looked at the 7 council lords seated behind the long table at the room's far end. She had learned, from what Pell had told her the evening before, that 6 of them would wait to see what the 7th decided. Councillor Dreth was the 7th, an elderly man whose face had been arranged over many years into an expression of perfect judicial neutrality that gave away, she thought, more about his character than blankness usually did. A face that did not perform was a face that had stopped needing to. Lady Matilda sat to the left, flanked by 2 advocates whose role was to hold papers and whisper when whispered to. She had presented the case with the same precise, methodical competence she brought to everything. No flourish, no appeal to feeling, simply the weight of the record laid out in order. 6 years of negotiation, a treaty with documented territorial benefit, the history of the alliance, its terms, the current strategic situation of the northern border. It was a very good case. Mavis had heard enough of it, from her position at the center of the chamber, to understand that it was correct on every point it raised. The alliance was real. The need was real. The 6 years were real. Mavis had no advocate. She had the compass. She placed it on the table. She had one other thing. She reached inside her cloak and brought out the sealed letter she had been sent to deliver, still sealed, because in the chaos of the night before, no one had actually taken it from Ronan's man, and opened it. She placed it beside the compass. "I was sent to deliver this," she said, "by the Council of the Eastern Territories, to the Alpha King's Council directly. I don't know what's in it." Councillor Dreth looked at the letter for a long moment. Aldous, who had seated himself in the observer's gallery with no formal role, but also with the unhurried certainty of someone who intended to be present regardless, said, "The Eastern Territories Council sent her. Not the Lady's House, not the Alpha King's household. The Eastern Council, which retains under the existing treaty framework the right to name the bearer of the Lunar Finder in any formal recognition proceeding." He said this in the tone of a man producing institutional context that he had been sitting on with some patience. The letter was sent before the hearth lit when she walked in. The letter and the event are not coincidental. I have compared the dates on the letter's outer seal against the dates on the Eastern Council's own record, which Brother Tyreth of their archive has provided in correspondence I received this morning. They align, Matilda said with perfect evenness. Brother Aldous is a respected archivist. He does not have the flaw. That is correct, Aldous said, unperturbed. I am providing institutional context. The Council may disregard it. Councillor Dreth said, The Council will not disregard it. He looked at the letter. Open it. Someone broke the seal. The Chamber Secretary read it aloud. 5 sentences, written in the formal hand of an Eastern Territories Council official, stamped with 3 seals, and signed by 7 names. It said that the bearer, Mavis of No House, carried the lunar finder by right of inheritance attested to the Eastern Council's satisfaction, and that in the event of a recognition event in the Alpha King's Hall, the Eastern Council wished to formally register the recognition under the terms of the original recognition accord of 318 years prior, which accord remained in force and had never been superseded. They had known. The Eastern Council had known what the compass was before Mavis had. They had sent her to that hall on purpose, carrying the letter that would mean something only if the hearth lit, and the hearth had lit. The silence in the chamber afterward was very complete. "My petition," Matilda said into it, and there was something in her voice now. The first small fracture of the morning, the tiniest fissure in the composure. Asked the Council to weigh the institutional basis of the current alliance against the weight of the older record. "Yes," Councillor Dreth said. He looked at her for a long moment, that held, Mavis thought, something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who had been asked an impossible question and had found it necessary to answer. "And we have weighed it, Lady Matilda." He set the letter down with great deliberateness. "Your claim in this matter is legitimate. Your conduct throughout has been exemplary. The Council is aware of what the alliance represents and does not dismiss its value." He folded his hands. "The lunar finder does not recognize political convenience. Neither does the recognition accord. I am sorry." Matilda looked at him. Then she looked at the compass on the table. Then she looked at Mavis. What was in her eyes was not defiance, and it was not grief, exactly. It was fear. The specific fear of 6 years of careful construction coming apart in a single chamber on a single afternoon. The fear of someone who had done everything correctly, and found, at the last, that correctly was not the only thing in the world that counted. It was a recognizable, human thing, and Mavis held her gaze and did not look away from it, because it deserved that much. Matilda stood. She gave the Council a formal, perfect bow. She left the chamber with her back straight and her head level, and her attendants folding behind her like wings, and she did not look back once. The petition was struck from the record. The betrothal was formally dissolved, on the Council's finding, by institutional authority. The Lords signed where Dreth indicated. The room held its silence while papers were gathered, and the Secretary sealed the record. Then Dreth looked up, and his expression had changed. Something small in it, something that was not Council procedure. 314 years, he said, and his voice was quieter now, more personal. The Hall is going to talk about this for the rest of its institutional memory. "I know," Mavis said. "Good," he said. "That means it will not forget." The chamber emptied by degrees. The advocates, the Lords, the Secretary with his bundled papers. Aldous paused on his way to the door and gave Mavis a single slow nod that contained, she thought, a very complete and satisfied commentary on the afternoon, and then he went. She was sitting on one of the hard stone benches along the chamber wall when Ronan came back in. He had been outside the chamber for the duration of the hearing, because the decision was the Council's to make, and he had understood, correctly, that his presence inside the room would have made it impossible for the Council to decide freely. He came back now the way he always moved through spaces, without announcement, filling the room exactly as much as he occupied, without requiring the room to make way. He sat on the bench across from her. They were alone, and the chamber was empty of ceremony or purpose now. Only cold grey stone and the pale blue light coming through the high narrow windows, the kind of light that had no warmth to give. He looked at her for a moment. He opened his mouth. She watched him decide against whatever he had been going to say, the decision moving through him like a small visible thing. The silence ran on. She did not fill it. She set the compass on the bench beside her, and they both looked at it, the needle resting, fixed, pointing at him with the directness of something that had no patience left for any kind of pretense or approximation. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. She felt him exhale. It was slow and deliberate, like a man setting down something he had carried for a long time through a very long corridor. She did not speak. She did not move. She put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palm, the deep, steady pulse of it, steadying further as they stayed. There was no need to say anything about what had happened, or what the council had decided, or what the next days would require. There was only the room and the cold light, and his forehead against hers, and the certainty, arriving without drama, that something had settled. They stayed like that, until the quality of light through the high windows shifted toward evening. Then he sat back, and he looked at her, and what was in his face was not the closed, precise authority she had seen across the great hall 2 days ago. He did not try to explain himself. She did not ask him to. 3 weeks later, the great hearth lit every morning. It did not do it with drama. There was no spectacle, no flash of cold air catching fire, no moment the court gathered to observe. Mavis would simply be crossing the hall on her way from the morning meal, still in the process of waking, and the ancient grate would catch warmth as she entered the room, the amber light climbing the stone wall, reaching the carved capitals of the columns, settling across the flagstones in that particular honey-coloured way of old firelight in old stone spaces. By the end of the second week, the servants had simply begun laying the kindling in the hearth each morning as a matter of habit, and then setting it properly alight when it did what it did. They had made it ordinary, which was the castle's way of accepting things it did not have a category for. Mavis found she was grateful for the pragmatism. Her room had been changed. She was in the upper eastern wing now, in an apartment with 2 windows rather than 1, a writing table in front of the larger window, a chair that had not come from storage and creaked. Someone had placed a small iron lamp on the desk. She had found a spare tallow candle in the drawer and had not mentioned the lamp to anyone. The compass sat on the desk. Its needle rested, fixed and steady, oriented toward wherever in the castle Ronan currently was. In the mornings it pointed toward the council wing. Later it shifted toward the outer ward, and then the practice ground, and then, more often than she would have predicted 3 weeks ago, toward the corridor that ran past her own door. She had stopped noting the pattern. She simply knew where he was, the way you came to know where in a familiar house the light was best at different hours. She was making a record of the Eastern Council's original documents, which Aldous had provided access to in the archive. 6 boxes of materials, some in very poor condition, the oldest of them water-damaged along the bottom corners, where they had been stored too low to the ground in some earlier century. The documents contained gaps and inconsistencies that Mavis found professionally unsatisfying in the way she found all incomplete records unsatisfying. She had not been a record-keeper in the scholarly sense. She had kept practical accounts for the dissolved house of her birth, inventories and ledgers and correspondence, the kind of careful accounting that kept a household running, and no one remembered to thank. The skill was the same: attention to what was missing, patience with what was obscured, refusal to fabricate where the evidence stopped. She worked at the desk in front of the window, while the courtyard below went through its morning routines. The calluses on her hands were from carrying and riding, from the specific grip of a woman who had moved through all weathers with things that needed to arrive intact, not ink-stained. She was not that kind of careful. She was the other kind, the kind that stayed with the thing through the difficulty and did not put it down until it was done. Pell brought tea in the mornings without being asked now. Mavis had said twice that she did not need it, and Pell had agreed both times with the specific pleasantness of someone who had already decided to continue, which Mavis recognized as a form of loyalty and had stopped arguing with. The tea was always the same, strong with a sprig of dried thyme that Mavis had not requested and had come to expect, and it arrived at the same time each morning, before Mavis had fully situated herself at the desk, as if Pell had calculated the exact moment of arrival that would be most useful and had committed to it. It was an ordinary Thursday in the 4th week when Ronan knocked. She had come to recognize his knock. 2 sounds, the first slightly heavier than the second, a pause between them that was specific enough to be identifiable, though she had not consciously learned to recognize it. She said, "Come in," and he did. He stood in the room for a moment in the way he had when he visited, simply being present, taking in the desk and the documents and the open compass, and Pell's tea going cold in its cup. Then he leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, in the posture she had begun to understand was his particular way of inhabiting a space without crowding it, and he said, "The councillor wants to set a date." "For what?" Mavis said, and then, "I understood, for the formal recognition." "There are protocols," he said. "Aldous is very enthusiastic about the protocols. I imagine he has been waiting for the protocols for 314 years. That is, I think, precisely how he experiences it." A pause that held something quiet in it. "Do you want to set a date?" She looked up from the document she had been annotating. He was watching her from the doorframe with those dark eyes and the quality of attention she had come to know well enough to read. Not the Alpha King's attention, which was authority surveying a situation. His attention. Specific, unhurried, honest about what it was doing. He was asking because the answer mattered, not because the answer would change what was already in the institutional record. The record was already fixed. He was asking about the rest of it. "Yes," she said. It was a small word. It cost her nothing, because she had already given it, somewhere between the cold bench in the council chamber and this morning, between the first sound of his knock and this moment of looking up from the page. She had been answering the question for 3 weeks without articulating it. This was only the articulation. He came the rest of the way into the room. He stood beside her desk and looked down at the compass on its surface, the needle pointing at him with perfect fidelity, with the patience of something that had been made for exactly this, and had always known it. And then he looked at her, and he kissed her forehead the way someone keeps a promise. She stayed very still for a moment, her hand resting on the page she had been annotating, the dried thyme from Pell's tea faintly in the air, the window light even, and grey gold on the desk. Then she went back to the document, and he sat down in the chair across from her desk. The chair she had not consciously begun to think of as his, but clearly had. And he said nothing, and she said nothing, and that was enough. The hearth in the great hall was burning. The needle was resting. The morning was ordinary in every way that mattered, which was, she was beginning to understand, the entire point of it. Not the fire that had lit itself, not the stopped needle, not the council chamber or the petition struck from the record. Those were the entrance. This was what they had been the entrance to. This ordinary morning, this desk, this chair, this quiet. She thought she might be beginning to understand that ordinary here was the whole point. If the compass in your hands had been spinning your whole life, pointing nowhere, and it finally stopped, pointing at the wrong door, the wrong moment, the wrong ceremony, would you have stayed? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.